All right, welcome everyone. We'd like to welcome you all to our series of conversations on biopolitics and democracy. In these conversations, we aim to explore the political tensions we experience in these challenging times of pandemic. And our aim is to raise awareness of the biopolitical dimensions of the ways in which states and society are dealing with the current global health crisis, and to understand the changes that the pandemic has brought upon our forms of life. With this, we'd also like to propose a collective and critical exercise of political imagination about the possible futures after the pandemic. And today we are delighted to have Team Christiaens with us. Tim has recently defended his PhD dissertation on Foucault, Agamben, and the history of governmentality at the Institute of Philosophy, KU Leuven. And starting in September, he will be, or actually perhaps August, he will be assistant professor of continental philosophy and economic ethics at Tilburg University. His research focuses on contemporary economic issues such as financialization, socioeconomic exclusion, and free market competition, viewed from the lens of Italian and French critical theory. His work has been published in journals such as Theory, Culture and Society, Philosophy and Social Criticism, Critical Sociology, and Cultural Critique. And Tim has also recently translated into Dutch Giorgio Agamben's book on the COVID-19 pandemic, L'epidemia come politica, and we will talk about that in a minute. So welcome, Tim. Thanks for being here. And just to start, the first question that we would like to ask you is whether you think that the idea of biopolitics helps us understand the current global pandemic. And if that's the case, why and how? And if that's not the case, why not?
Yeah, so of course it will not entirely surprise you that for someone who recently, like you said, defended this dissertation on neoliberal biopolitics, that of course I will say that biopolitics is relevant today. So, and it's easy to see how, right? When Foucault starts talking about biopolitics in mid-1970s, he does it to explain the rise of a particular form of state policy that bases itself on statistics, tries to manage the population in terms of public health care and the economic vitality of the population, etc. And so we can see this also happening today. So every day on the news, we get these stats, these statistics about infection rates, the R value of the spread of COVID-19, the amount of beds taken in the ICU, etc. So it's easy to see how this biopolitical concern is at play nowadays. But we shouldn't also forget that when Foucault writes about these issues, he does it to explain a very specific phenomenon in a very specific place and time, namely France in the 18th century. And so we should also be wary of the differences that exist between today and France in the 18th century. And I think we can delineate three important differences nowadays. So one thing is that when Foucault writes about biopolitics, for him and as for his 18th century subjects, it's still pretty clear that biopolitics is about the governance of human populations. And so the state collects information about citizens and tries to manage the birth rates and mortality rates, etc., of those citizens. Whereas nowadays, it's clear that governments not only have to care for their human populations, but also for all kinds of non-human agents and that are also interacting with this human population. So to give you a kind of very exemplary case, a few months ago, there were debates in the Netherlands and in Denmark about mink breeding, and because they imagined that mink were actually, or there was a risk that those populations would become kind of breeding grounds for variants of the COVID-19 virus. So the state shouldn't only concern itself with the spread of the virus among humans, but also among the animals. And even more, when we start looking at, for instance, where the virus comes from, and there's now renewed debate about it, but still kind of the general theories that comes from interaction between humans and bats in China. And there we can see that actually our kind of biopolitical efforts are always embedded in a larger ecosystem of human and non-human interactions. And that means that a state biopolitics is always in a certain sense in vain. It cannot fully manage this whole ecosystem. And so it must imagine itself as simply one strategy within this larger ecosystem that it cannot control. Whereas for Foucault and for the 18th century, there was still a clear opposition between human beings that governed, or the state that governed the population from a kind of hierarchical top-down position. And that kind of imaginary no longer works very well today. So that's kind of as a first difference. A second then is that when Foucault talks about biopolitics, it's as an explanatory factor for the rise or the emergence of the modern nation state. Whereas today we can see that biopolitics is actually superseding that national or that state-centric framework. So when we talk, for instance, about vaccination policies, it's clear that in the Western European countries that we're now at, that vaccination campaigns are going rather smoothly at the moment. But as long as other countries are not vaccinating at all, or at a very low level or very low speed, it doesn't really matter what we're doing in Western countries, because new variants will emerge and the whole charade will start all over again. So it seems here that, I mean, on the one hand, this calls for a kind of global governance perspective, where we kind of supersede or kind of transcend this nation state level. But on the other hand, there are also vectors pulling in the opposite direction. And so, for instance, when we look at the economics of it, do we really, as for instance, Western countries, do we really want to work in this global governance network where, for instance, we could be dependent on Chinese production of medical equipment? And that was the case. I mean, just a year ago, it turned out that mouth masks and ICU equipment was all made in China, which meant that the United States and Western Europe suddenly were very dependent on Chinese production. And so now you have people calling for, well, don't we need to localize some of this medical equipment production back into, for instance, Western Europe? So on the one hand, we have this push towards a global governance network, with also all the democratic problems that come with that. But on the other hand, you also have the opposite pull towards more localization of production systems, for instance. So that's a second element. And then as a third thing, we should know that when Foucault talks about biopolitics, he does it from a very specific model of explaining power relations. So in the, let's say, first half of the 1970s, Foucault takes a Nietzschean and Clausewitzian perspective on power, and he says, well, it's this antagonistic relations of forces kind of hitting upon each other. And so it's called the war model of power. And so power is being involved in a kind of war, and we should see politics as a war by other means. And so what he does in the 1970s, he writes the history or the genealogy of that form of power, especially in a lecture series called Society Must Be Defended, where he traces that history from the notion of race wars in early modern France, up until the 20th century, where he sees a kind of more biological model of race showing up with the state positing itself as a protector of the biological security of the national race against all forms of what, for instance, the Nazis would have called inferior genes. And so that's the kind of history that Foucault writes. And from that perspective, it's easy to diagnose biopolitics as a form of hunt on inferior genes or unhealthy, contaminating influences on the population. And so, for instance, when Agamben then starts writing about the pandemic, he does it from that perspective. And so he says, well, it's completely unjust that we're all locked up in our homes so that the state can track, manage, and eradicate the virus, eliminating any kind of political or democratic concern for the good life beyond mere survival. And I mean, we will probably talk more about this later, because I mean, he has a point, but it misses, for instance, some of the positive aspects of biopolitics. For instance, imagine that we would have had to manage this crisis without public health care or without a welfare state, without a social security system. It would have been even more disastrous. And also, because you focus so much on kind of state-inspired oppression as kind of the main culprit, you miss out on other forms of injustice as well. So, for instance, one that I've written about a couple of times the last few months is also forms of sacrificial neglect in the state apparatus. So, where the state only cares for some parts of the population, where kind of this biopolitical management is worth the investment, whereas there are other parts of the population that are not worthy of this form of investment. And so we've seen that, for instance, in all forms of essential workers. And so there were, immediately when the pandemic started, there were scandals about infection rates rising in, for instance, the meat industry or the food industry in general, or for instance, the distribution sector like Amazon and these kinds of companies, where you can see that for those workers, they were not worthy of the investment of their biological security or their health. And so whenever one of these workers got sick, they were simply replaced by someone else. And that was supposedly cheaper than securing their protection. And so this form of sacrificial neglect becomes, as I say, rather obscure if you take this warm model of biopolitics as your main target of your social analysis. So that's kind of what I would see, the three differences. So these non-human factors, this supersession of the level of the nation state, and well, the problems with this war model of power.
Okay, thanks, Tim. That's interesting. I think that a little bit in your answer, you point to the political changes that are taking place in the responses of states to the pandemic. So could you comment maybe a little bit more about the changes that you see emerging in these responses, especially the state responses? Yeah. And also, you know, since democracy is also a part of our concerns here, do you think that democratic life has been affected by the global health crisis, both in the sort of current existing democratic institutions, but also in the potential democratic institutions still to be created?
Yeah. Well, I think you would have to situate the response to this pandemic in kind of a larger, longer, what I would call with Gramsci, an organic crisis of the modern nation state today. And so you can see that was already happening before the pandemic, that there's a kind of general loss of confidence in kind of central political and cultural institutions. And so that's why we have all these debates among institutions that used to be hegemonic, but now seem at the center of debates. Like in the university, we have these debates about whether critical race theory should be taught or not. Or we have similar debates about, is journalism really expressing the general opinion of the people, or are they all the mainstream media that are in the hands of big capital, big corporations, or the liberal elites or whatever? We have similar discussions also about the police, for instance. Do the police express a kind of popular consensus about what kind of behavior should be punished and which one should not be? Or is this up for debate? Are they actually a class or race-related institution? So you can see this popping up with all kinds of institutions that used to be hegemonic or used to express this popular consensus, whereas nowadays that consensus seems to falter. And then the question is, of course, how do people respond? How do states respond? And I must be honest with you, in the course of this pandemic, I'm not very optimistic or not very hopeful about the kinds of responses that I've seen. So on the one hand, you have governments, and they have tried to impose a form of consensus in how they manage public health care today via two means. One is by creating this kind of spectacle of fear. So for instance, I'm currently in Belgium, and so the first lockdown in Belgium started right after we saw the images of the hospitals in Bergamo in Italy. And so, of course, these images were horrific, and they were used by the government to impose a very harsh lockdown, because they knew, well, once people have seen that, they will accept anything. And so that's how kind of the state of emergency started in Belgium, through this kind of spectacularization of fear. On the other hand, you've seen that because, of course, that kind of fear through spectacle only works for a certain amount of time. And afterwards, you see that what governments have tried to do is minimize kind of democratic interventions or democratic inclusion, and try to avoid all direct confrontations with the public. And so they do that through, for instance, declaring something like a state of emergency or a state of exception. Or, for instance, kind of in a lighter mode, politicians can depoliticize their policies by saying, well, we're only doing what virological experts are telling us to do, as if there are no political stakes involved in that. And so what we've seen is kind of a combination of this kind of spectacular fear-mongering coupled with what I would call biomedical technocracy. And so a technocratic, less democratic form of government based on biomedical science as one's main source of legitimation. So that's on the level of the state. Now, on the other hand, you can also ask the question, well, has the public lived up to its civic democratic responsibilities? And also there seem to be problems, especially when we start looking at the rate of dissemination of things like conspiracy theories. And we see that throughout these last decades, the public has become used to not seeing itself as kind of an architect of democratic policies, or someone who contributes to democracy, but rather as consumers of state policies. And so whenever the state does not deliver the policies that I desire, I reject that commodity provider, so to speak. And so they turn to, let's say, other forms of, say, service providers to provide exactly what they need. So in this case of, let's take the case of information, we no longer accept the information we get from the state, because the state doesn't tell us what we like to hear. So we go online and we look for exactly the kind of information that we want. And so conspiracy theories are there, of course, I mean, the obvious or the ideal form of information commodity we can have. Because just like you can say, a smartphone is basically just a platform onto which we then upload all the apps and whatever that we want. So we can use that commodity in whatever way we like it, because it's basically just a blank canvas of potentialities. In the same way, you can say, well, a conspiracy theory is like a smartphone, but on the level of information. It can mean whatever we want it to mean. So whenever something in kind of the political conjuncture changes, you can see that these conspiracy theories change as well to accommodate for that particular development. And so whenever, for instance, right-wing pundits come up with something like critical race theory, well, you can see that all these conspiracy theories move in the same direction, and critical race theories is yet another form of the same conspiracy of lizard-like democratic politicians, I mean, etc., etc. I mean, you know the drill. So you can see there that conspiracy theories, because they are so malleable and so, I say, quickly to evolve, that they become the ideal form of commodity in this consumption of information. And then, let's say, on a third level, because especially someone like Foucault would expect democratic politics to emerge from, for instance, social movements. They would say, well, that's where you get the production of new forms of counter-conduct or counter-knowledges, and that can oppose, for instance, a biomedical technocracy from the state. I mean, to give an example, you see something like that in the ecological movement, where you can see that the ecological movement before the 1960s was very anti-science, whereas after the 1960s, they start using all kinds of scientific data about climate change, about pollution, etc., to present a counter-narrative to the state and to big industry. And so someone like Foucault, for instance, someone like Ulrich Beck, would expect resistance or kind of counter-hegemony to come from there. And there are good examples of that nowadays. For instance, I think we can see Black Lives Matter as that kind of social movement that provides a new way of articulating, for instance, knowledge about the police. But it's very small mostly, and very kind of focused on particular moments in time without a lot of longevity. And I think that has to do with the kind of political economy of knowledge production that we're now in. And so we can see that, I mean, knowledge today is produced in things like universities, think tanks, international organizations, but it used to be a lot more. So for instance, trade unions are not longer producing the same kind of dominant knowledge that they used to. And so the kind of social circles of where intellectuals are coming from, or what Gramsci would have called the organic intellectuals, is becoming smaller and smaller. And also, I mean, with cuts at universities, also there you can see that it's becoming smaller. And so this also means that you get a kind of monoculture or culture of the kind of knowledge that is being produced. Whereas then lots of resistant counter knowledges become very low quality because there's no longer that same level of investment in it anymore. So hence my reasons why I'm not very optimistic.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there are so many things to say there, but perhaps just to go back to some of the things that you were saying at the beginning of this answer, when you were referring to the notion of the state of emergency, the state of exception, you know, like a certain way in which the management of the pandemic could also be seen as a threat to democracy or to some of the democratic freedoms that as citizens we kind of expect to have. As I was mentioning at the beginning, you just translated into Dutch Georgia Gambin's series of reflections on the current pandemic. And perhaps you would like to, I mean, it would be nice if you could tell us something more about that, something more about what is distinctive of his reading of the pandemic, both the qualities and the limits of his approach.
Yeah, I must say for me, I started translating it as a kind of therapeutic exercise. Because, well, I've worked on Agamben now for so long. And once these opinion pieces started coming out last year, I was quite shocked because I didn't agree with them at all. So then, of course, I mean, you end up in a situation where kind of your main source of intellectual inspiration starts disappointing you. So it was therapeutic for me to kind of to translate them and to get a kind of deeper sense of what Agamben is getting at and also what his limitations exactly are. So what I've kind of gathered is that on the one hand, his style is very exaggerated, lots of hyperboles. So he compares university teachers teaching online to fascists. He says, well, social life is done. We're all, everything's online now. And democracy is over. There's the permanent state of exception, etc., etc. And I read it a bit like he performs the role of an Old Testament doomsayer. So in the Old Testament, you have prophets that argue, well, the population is, or the people is so corrupted by sin that they will only listen to the word of God if it's presented to them in kind of a shock treatment. And Agamben tries to perform that kind of shock treatment because he believes that society, and especially the public sphere nowadays, is completely enraptured in this society of the spectacle, that it needs this kind of shock to come back to its senses. And of course, then the question is, well, is that true? And that's where I start to diverge from Agamben. I don't think that that's a correct assessment of the situation. The problem is not that we're kind of, let's say, imprisoned in one-dimensional thought, but rather we are overwhelmed by mutually incompatible information that is presented to us through our smartphones and through our computers every day. And we've lost a narrative. So in that kind of situation, this kind of shock value that Agamben presents risks to add fuel to the fire. There are already lots of very exaggerated opinions around, and Agamben is just going to polarize these opinions even further than they already were. Also, another problem is, well, these Old Testament prophets, they could kind of derive their authority to speak from a transcendent source of legitimacy, God. And so everyone was corrupted by sin, but the prophet had access to God's word, and hence they could present the truth immediately. But then the question is, well, what authorizes Agamben to present the truth? Why is he not part of the spectacle? I mean, he's not relying on the God, but on what is he relying on? And he doesn't explain that, because I don't think there really is this kind of transcendent source that could legitimate his discourse and delegitimize all other discourses. What we're left with is this kind of struggle for hegemony that I was talking about. So I think that there were the limits of Agamben's kind of very scandalous way of presenting this. So although, I say, on kind of purely empirical level, he might be, as it were, he might be right in posing what the risks are of our current situation. So indeed, and the state of exception, biomedical technocracy, and the loss of kind of face-to-face human communication, these are real risks. He is right about that. But the way in which he presents them kind of undermines his own message. So I say I'm more opposed to the way in which he said it than to what he actually says, because I think that actually lots of people would agree with that.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Now, considering what we're discussing and what we've discussed so far, how do you think, to be more forward-looking now, how do you think the experience of the pandemic will affect our post-COVID life and, you know, our ways of doing and engaging in critique, for example?
Yeah. Well, the problem, of course, is that because I've just kind of criticized Agamben for this kind of prophetic mode of speech. So now when I start explaining what the future will look like, of course, I'm falling into the same trap. But so, and the thing is also that when it comes to the future, I just don't know. And to give like a simple example, or kind of one particular example that I'm looking at right now is economic policies. You see that on the one hand, people are talking about the end of neoliberalism. And there is a point to that, in that lots of the policies states and central banks have been putting out are not exactly the same kind of austerity policies that we saw 10 years ago. They're very different. Lots of public investment is involved. So you can see a change in policy. But on the other hand, you see on TV, for instance, the same media pundits keep showing up in the same talk shows, pulling out the same information and the same discourses. So the question is, well, this change of policy, is that something very conjunctural for a specific moment in our crisis right now, or will that have effects later on? Because now we can see that the media landscape hasn't yet adapted to this change of policy. So it can still go in two directions. And who knows, maybe next year we will be talking about austerity again. It's possible. Or we might be talking about the Green New Deal, a completely different kind of idea. And so these are still quite open. So what I would say what we should do now is, I think, mostly experiment with all kind of possible political forms that we can imagine right now. And so because we're in the state of organic crisis, we don't yet know what the future will bring. So what we need to do is a kind of, say, a progressive left or a kind of critical theory, or whatever you want to call it, is kind of be ready for whatever situation pops up. So we mostly have to be flexible with different forms of political organization, and well, it might turn out that some of them will work and others will not. But it's through this experimentation that we will find out. So to give one example, 10 years ago, we were discussing, or we were celebrating all kinds of different forms of internet activism, the Arab Spring, anonymous hacking. Whereas nowadays, when we talk about internet activism, we're talking about right-wing or alt-right trolls and the incel movement and these kinds of phenomena. And so none of these political forms in themselves are inherently progressive or conservative or reactionary, or it depends on the manner in which they are used in a particular political situation. It depends on how they are articulated in that situation, whether they are progressive or not. So I would say that right now, because the future is so unclear, that we mostly have to, say, keep our options open. And so hence what I mean with this form of experimentation with political forms.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's pretty much the direction in which this project also goes, this idea of a certain exercise, collective exercise of political imagination, that it's also an exercise in experimenting something new for the future without wanting to legislate the forms that the future would take. It was a real pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone who is listening. Please feel free to check the other videos that we have on the website. And Tim, thanks again, and hopefully we'll talk soon again about other future projects.
Okay, thanks. All right.